Imagine for just a second a completely unknown corporate entity that operates as if money literally does not exist. I mean, a company moving with such aggressive, unbelievable financial swagger that it legitimately seems like they've unlocked some kind of real-world cheat code for infinite wealth. They act completely untouchable. They sweep in and buy up the world's absolute most expensive real estate. They purchase the very peak of global human attention, and they throw hundreds of millions of dollars around like it's literally just pocket change. To the outside world, to the general public, and especially to their investors, they project this massive, impenetrable empire built on solid gold. But in the shadows of the boardroom, away from the cameras and the flashing lights, a completely different and frankly terrifying reality is taking shape. It is a story of extreme financial leverage, a truly brilliant public illusion, and a brutal internal reckoning. So what actually happens when a company buys the entire world's attention, only to suddenly realize they can't actually afford it? Just think about the sheer mind-boggling scale of this spending spree for a moment. We're talking about a company that casually drops $700 million just to slap their logo on one of the most famous sports arenas on the planet. And they locked that in for 20 years. But they didn't stop there. No way. They hired absolute A-list Hollywood royalty. They brought in Matt Damon to stare into a camera and tell the entire world that fortune favors the brave. They bought a wildly expensive Super Bowl ad featuring a digitally de-aged CGI LeBron James. You have to understand, this wasn't just standard marketing. This was a massive financial flex designed to show off absolute, unquestionable dominance. They were effectively buying trust by associating themselves with the most trusted, most expensive brands in modern culture. But here is the massive twist to our corporate thriller. While the public was totally dazzled by these glittering, nine-figure marketing campaigns, behind closed doors, this exact same company was preparing to quietly and methodically slash their own workforce straight to the bone. Over 4,000 employees. At the absolute peak of this insane spending spree, that is how many people were sitting comfortably at their desks, probably feeling incredibly secure in their careers. I mean, think about it. They were working for what appeared to be the wealthiest, fastest-growing tech giant on the planet. They literally sat at home and watched their own employer buy Super Bowl ads and sponsor massive global sporting events. But what those 4,000 people didn't know was that the very same aggressive financial leverage that bought those flashy ads was about to make their jobs entirely expendable. The company was dangerously overextended. The proverbial corporate credit card was completely maxed out, and a devastating, multi-phase purge was lurking right around the corner. Okay, let's really dive into this explainer. The architect behind this massive illusion of infinite wealth? It's Crypto.com. Originally founded back in 2016 under the name Monaco by Kris Marszalek and a few others, it eventually went through a massive rebrand after they bought that premium domain name for millions of dollars. And their growth? Honestly, it was nothing short of explosive. They skyrocketed from a very respectable 10 million users in early 2021 to a staggering 100 million global users. They built out an entire ecosystem. We're talking an exchange, a digital wallet, an NFT marketplace, and even their own massive token called Kronos. But here's the catch. To acquire those 100 million users, they didn't just rely on having good technology. They relied heavily on a strategy of extreme financial leverage, basically borrowing against their own future to buy the present. Now notice exactly how this extreme leverage looked on paper because it's wild. Crypto.com went on a sponsorship spending spree that the sports and finance worlds had literally almost never seen before. We're talking about that monumental $700 million 20-year deal to rename the iconic Staples Center in Los Angeles to the Crypto.com Arena. They inked a massive $100 million deal with Formula One. They sponsored the UFC, the FIFA World Cup, and they even planned an unbelievable $495 million sponsorship with the UEFA Champions League. They essentially blanketed the entire earth with their brand. But in the ultra-competitive world of high-stakes business, massive marketing spending doesn't always equal massive cash reserves. Quite the opposite, actually. Often, it's just a smokescreen. It masks a highly fragile operational reality just under the surface. They were banking on endless exponential growth in a bull market that would just never, ever end.
There's a really bitter, almost poetic irony in this quote from the creative director who was behind their famous LeBron James Super Bowl commercial. He was talking about the inspirational message of the ad itself, about taking big risks to build a great future. But if you read between the lines of what was actually happening at the corporate level at that very moment, it takes on a whole new meaning. The leadership of Crypto.com was indeed making massive, supposedly courageous, or perhaps totally reckless financial decisions that would absolutely dictate their future. They were literally making billion-dollar bets while millions of people were watching, but they were doing all of it with maxed-out metaphorical credit cards, just desperately hoping the music wouldn't stop.
Which brings us to part one of our story, cracks in the foundation and the brutal arrival of the crypto winter. Because eventually, the music did stop. When the broader market downturn hit, things got incredibly dark, incredibly fast. Interest rates shifted, brutal macroeconomic headwinds picked up, and the entire cryptocurrency market suddenly lost trillions in value. And this brings us to a grim, terrifying timeline. You see, when a massively over-leveraged company suddenly realizes it's bleeding cash, it usually tries to avoid public panic at all costs. You really don't want the market to know you're struggling right after you just paid to put your name on a legendary arena, right? So the purge started quietly. In June 2022, they announced a supposedly modest 5% workforce reduction, just trimming the fat, they claimed. But by August, reports started leaking that they were quietly letting go of hundreds more people in the shadows. By October 2022, the ugly truth was completely out. They had actually slashed an estimated 30 to 40% of their entire staff. Over 2,000 human jobs were just erased. And then, the highly publicized collapse of a rival exchange, FTX, sent massive shockwaves through the whole industry, damaging public trust completely. In response to that, January 2023 saw Crypto.com slash yet another 20% of its remaining global workforce. The human cost of their rapid, unchecked expansion was absolutely staggering.
But here is the really crucial point to understand. It wasn't just the everyday employees paying the ultimate price. The sheer panic behind the scenes in the executive suites was immense. Crypto.com was now scrambling desperately to shed its incredibly bloated financial commitments. Remember that massive $495 million deal with the UEFA Champions League we talked about? Yeah, they backed right out of it at the absolute last minute. They quietly ended their sponsorships with the Los Angeles-based soccer team Angel FC. They walked back their major deal with Twitch Esports. They even had to drastically cut back on their luxury hospitality packages for the FIFA World Cup. The grand illusion was fading fast. The company was now in pure, unadulterated survival mode, frantically throwing heavy ballast overboard just to keep the entire ship from sinking into the abyss.
Now for part 2, the AI scapegoat in a completely bizarre corporate pivot. Survival in the high-stakes corporate world often requires a really good narrative. You have to be able to explain to your nervous investors and the skeptical public exactly why you are shrinking so fast. So, in March of 2026, Crypto.com announced yet another round of layoffs, cutting around 12% of its remaining staff. But this time, it wasn't blamed on a crypto winter. It wasn't blamed on macroeconomic headwinds. CEO Kris Marszalek issued a remarkably cold, highly corporate statement. He explicitly told the impacted employees that they were being let go because their roles, quote, do not adapt in our new world. He essentially blamed this fresh round of layoffs almost entirely on the company's sudden shift toward enterprise-wide AI. Instead of just admitting that the company was still right-sizing from its previous era of horrific overspending, leadership pointed the finger directly at the employees themselves, boldly claiming they simply couldn't keep up with artificial intelligence.
Marszalek then completely doubled down, stating publicly on social media, companies that do not make this pivot immediately will fail. Companies that move slowly will be left behind. Now, from a strictly business perspective, this is a fascinating, if somewhat brutal tactic. He weaponized the massive trending AI narrative as a highly convenient scapegoat for what was actually just necessary financial downsizing. And sadly, Crypto.com definitely wasn't alone in doing this. They were actually following a pretty grim trend among several over-leveraged tech giants, companies like Block and Atlassian, who also slashed thousands of jobs and conveniently cited the new AI era as the primary reason, rather than just admitting to poor financial planning and reckless overhiring during the boom years. Honestly, it's a masterful deflection of corporate responsibility.
And that leads us to part 3, the aftermath, and survival at absolutely any cost.
So, when you've slashed nearly half of your peak workforce and burned through an immeasurable amount of public goodwill, how do you actually rebuild? Well, you pivot. Hard. You scramble to find entirely new revenue streams, you seek out new regulatory approvals, and you lock down new partners. You switch from relying on pure marketing hype to executing cold, hard financial survival tactics. And from a pure business and investment perspective, their survival strategy has been incredibly aggressive. In 2025, they entered into a strategic, highly lucrative partnership with Trump Media. This resulted in a massive $105 million token acquisition deal and the full integration of their digital wallet right into Truth Social. This move alone opened up an entirely new demographic of users and tapped into highly active prediction markets. Furthermore, they secured a massive, stabilizing partnership with traditional finance heavyweight Deutsche Bank to handle their corporate banking in Asia and Australia. They are even actively pursuing a national trust bank charter with the U.S. government so they can become a fully, federally regulated custodian. They are currently doing everything in their absolute power to embed themselves deeply into the traditional financial system,
purely to ensure they never face an existential crisis like that ever again.
But here is the funny thing about corporate DNA. It rarely ever changes completely. Despite all those massive layoffs, despite coldly blaming AI for cutting human jobs, and despite their serious pivot to acquiring boring banking charters, their deep-seated addiction to flashy, jaw-dropping spending never truly died. In February of 2026, CEO Kris Marszalek spent an absolutely astonishing $70 million just to buy the domain name AI.com. Let that sink in for a second. $70 million for a web address, which they then heavily promoted during a Super Bowl LX ad for their brand new prediction market. The very same company that just fired hundreds of people for allegedly not adapting to AI turned around and dropped $70 million on an AI website name.
And honestly, this brilliantly illustrates the ultimate paradox of these modern, hyper-leveraged tech companies. Look at the left side of your screen. That is the public illusion. $700 million dropped on an arena, $70 million for a domain name, hiring Hollywood actors, and running Super Bowl commercials. All of it carefully designed to project absolute, unquestionable invincibility. Now look at the right side. That is the grim internal reality. Thousands upon thousands of human jobs quietly eliminated in the shadows, entire corporate departments completely gutted, and loyal employees openly blamed for not adapting fast enough. And all of this happened just so the company could survive the harsh reality of its own reckless spending habits.
So going through this explainer really leaves us looking at the modern financial landscape with a heavy dose of realism. We see the bright logos on the side of the stadiums, we watch these incredibly high production ads on TV, and we just assume these companies are rock solid. But this story definitively proves that extreme financial leverage can turn a seemingly invincible giant into a fragile house of cards practically overnight. So I want to leave you with this final thought to really chew on. When a massively leveraged financial entity buys the entire world's attention, but realizes it can't actually afford to keep its own people, is it genuinely building the future of finance, or is it just selling us a very expensive, very beautiful illusion?